We're going to go ahead and get the meeting started. That's okay. This is the July 17th City of Murfreesboro Pension Committee meeting. Frida, do we have any public comment?
No.
Okay. So unfortunately, we do not have a quorum this morning, so several of the items that are action items, we will have to defer into the next meeting. So I expect that we'll meet next month if we can get a quorum then. We have Amy Kraus of Acrisure on the phone to review some assumption changes as well as engagement letter for the next 4 years. Amy, you're welcome to present the information. The committee members that are here can ask questions. We just can't vote on it today. And then we will, after your presentation, we can kind of discuss the next steps. But I apologize. That was a very sudden change. We had a couple people who just notified us that we're going to be out of town, and then another member is sick today. That kind of threw us out of whack. Sorry. All right. Amy, are you on the phone?
That's okay.
Okay. So if you want to go ahead and move into the assumptions and funding method report that you sent to the committee, we can go ahead and listen to that and have discussion. We just can't vote.
Okay, and then do I need to share my screen, or does the committee have the presentation in front of them?
We have the printed presentation, so if you can just proceed that way.
Okay, great. Thanks, Erin. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for your time this morning. My name is Amy Kraus, and I have Bob Hazy also on the line with me, both actuaries at Acrisure, and we want to take a few minutes to talk about some actuarial assumption change recommendations that we have for the pension plan, and then get into kind of an introductory conversation around the current funding policy, and a lot of this dealing with the closed nature of the plan, so no new participants entering into the plan has kind of a large influence on this. And so if you move along in our presentation, we're going to start on slide 3 and jump right into these actuarial assumptions. So the first one is the mortality base table, and what this means is for the pension plan, when you're funding these benefits into the future, putting money in today for future benefits, we have to make assumptions as far as how long an individual and their beneficiary will live. And so we look to various studies that are available out there, put together by professional organizations, and the pension plan, the current assumption has been in place for many years now. And in 2019, the Society of Actuaries had published a mortality study that looked at pension plans for the public sector. So the city's experience would be included within this, and specific to public entities, local governments. And the prior actuary, I know that they would look at these assumptions every 5 years. So they had finished their review in 2018, right before this new mortality table was published. And so when we look at the current assumption versus this new table, as a whole, the total liability would be comparable. So it's not a bad current assumption, the current assumption that we have, but as we move along and as the group of pension participants for the city's plan starts to shrink and we start to see older ages, because again, we have none of the new participants coming in, what we'll see is, as a whole, the law of large numbers, doesn't work out as much. And so we want to make sure that the city has an accurate or maybe more appropriate view of future funding for their participants. And so based on that, based on this study, which the acronyms for it are what you see under the proposed. So the PUB stands for public. It was a public plan study that used data through 2010, And then the other symbols, so Pub S is public safety. So we would use the Pub S 2010 table for your fire and police participants who, as you can imply, that their life expectancy, because of the nature of the work that they do, is less than your general employees. So then Pub G would be the general employees. We'll apply that to all non-public safety. And then they also noted in their study that survivors and beneficiaries have slightly different lifetimes after the participant dies. So, when somebody's spouse dies, then we see that the life expectancy of the survivor isn't quite as long as when both are living. So our proposal and recommendation is to use this public sector mortality table. I strongly believe that the prior actuary would have recommended this change with their next experience review because the data that underlines it is specific to the public sector where the city resides. And so with this recommended change, what happens is we recognize a change in liability, and that increase in liability would then have to be paid through your contributions. And so the cost impact that we're looking at would be approximately $500,000 increase in annual contribution from the after we implement this with the 2024 report. It would be the next fiscal year when it gets implemented, and so it would be that amount through 2041 would be the impact of this. But when you look at the cost impact, what we're trying to do with assumptions is reflect what we think will be your actual experience. So even if we kept the current assumption, we would start to see in future years a gain or loss because the actual mortality experience of the plan would have to be reflected. And so by changing assumptions, it's really a matter of changing the timing of those contributions. So we're trying to reflect what we think is more appropriate for the city's experience, and that's going to result in a $500,000 increase, annual contribution increase for the next 17 years or so. And if we didn't implement this, then you would see variations of that 500,000 just based on actual experience of the plan being reflected, because whatever the retirees do, however long they live, the city is going to have to pay those benefit payments. And so this is a proactive way of trying to recognize that public plan experience overall, because the liabilities increase, means that life expectancy is longer for your participants than under the current assumption, and that's why you see the increase in the liability. So we also note that this table is currently being used by the Tennessee Consolidated Retirement System, so the statewide system. They also implement these tables, and we use these tables for almost all, if not all, of our public sector pension plans. So I will pause there because this is going to be the biggest change as far as cost-wise for the assumption recommendations that we have. So I'll pause to see if there's any questions.
I'm just curious why 2041 was the end date? How did that?
Sure. So we're going to talk in a couple minutes about the current funding policy, but essentially every year when you have a gain or loss, when actual experience differs from the assumptions, you have to pay it off over time. And so under the current funding policy, any changes, whether by gain loss by experience or changes in assumptions, have to be paid by 2041. That's the current funding policy of the plan.
Okay, thanks.
That was a 30-year amortization, is that right?
It started as a 40-year. It was put in place in 2001 as a 40-year, and then every year it ticks down 1 year. And again, that's part of the conversation that we're going to get into in just a few minutes.
Okay. And then there is no immediate funding requirement with this assumption change, correct?
So the immediate change would be the $500,000. So when the July 2024 report is put in place, we'll calculate that new ADC rate, percentage of payroll. So when that is implemented a year later, that's when you'll see the uptick in the cost.
Right.
So essentially a year from now.
I just wanted to confirm, I know there are certain things that we're required to fully fund if we change within the plan, like if we offered a COLA, for example, I believe we're required to fully fund that at that time, and then also deal with the annual increases as well. So I just wanted to confirm there was nothing that was immediate like that situation.
Correct. And
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Aaron. Well, I was just going to say with that, whenever you have a benefit plan change, so this is an assumption change, but if you were changing the actual plan benefits, if you change it for your inactive retirees that are already collecting, that's when you have to do the immediate contribution that you're talking about.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, I don't see any other questions on that topic.
Okay, great. So moving on to slide 4, connected to the mortality base table are mortality improvement scales. And essentially what this says is as time goes on, there's more and more developments in prescription drugs and treatments. There could be cures to different diseases discovered that weren't there previously. And so what we do is we reflect that going forward, longevity will continue to increase for the population as a whole. And so the mortality improvement scale that's currently being used for the pension plan is called the MP 2021. And there hasn't been a release since that because COVID and just kind of our nation and global experience of mortality and things because of the COVID-19 pandemic really kind of threw an unknown wrench as to what's long-term, what would be long-term COVID, what's short-term, those types of things. But what we're proposing is whenever a new improvement scale is published and released, and again, the Society of Actuaries, they have a group that looks at this every year. What we're proposing is we would use whatever the current published mortality improvement scale is. And essentially by doing this, we're recognizing a little change each year instead of waiting 5 or 10 years and making a change to the improvement scale and having a bigger cost impact. So historically, the annual updates have had a very, very small impact as far as costs and things, and could go up and down just kind of depending on the actual data that's being reviewed and put in there for consideration. So again, this is something that the Society of Actuaries publish, and so it works hand in hand with those new public sector mortality tables that we're proposing to go to. And under support, again, the TCRS plans also use this improvement scale, which would be, you know, your peers and what's going on within the state of Tennessee. So the cost impact, there's no cost impact currently because the current table that's published out there is the one that we're using. It would just be in future years you would see slight changes as the scales typically will grab one more year of actual experience and make small adjustments to what they think future improvement may be.
That makes sense.
So I'll pause for any questions.
I don't think there are any questions on that. I think that makes sense and is very logical.
Okay, great. So moving on to slide 5, since we just took over the actuarial work of the pension plan, we don't have a full history of plan census data and experience. And so we wanted to take a look at anything that we currently had, and we'll hold off on some other assumptions that we'll need just more years of experience in order to be able to adequately review them. But one of the things we can look at is the form of payment elections. So retirees, when they retire, they can elect from a single life annuity where it's payable for their lifetime and it has so many months guaranteed. They also have different options for joint and survivor, where it's payable for their lifetime, and then when they are deceased, if they have a survivor, so a spouse that's still living, then the spouse would receive a certain percentage of the benefit for the rest of his or her lifetime. And so the current assumption was just simply everybody takes a single life annuity. It's not uncommon to see that within actuarial reports, where you just say it's the normal form of payment under the plan. But we looked at the current retirees, those who are collecting payments, and we saw a pretty significant amount were electing the joint and survivor form of payment. So they have a benefit payable for their lifetime, and then when they are deceased, their spouse is still living, will continue to collect a portion of it. And so what we propose to do is, instead of reflecting everybody takes a single life annuity, we want to reflect that some will elect a joint and survivor. And for the assumptions, instead of going through all the available forms of payment, we simply said anybody with a single life annuity type of form, no contingency, will be one bucket, and then anybody that has elected a joint survivor, we're going to put them just in the simple 50% joint survivor bucket. And so our proposal is 60% will elect some form of a single life annuity with a guarantee, and then the other 40% will elect some form of joint survivor, but for purposes of the funding of the plan, we're going to assume it's the 50% joint survivor annuity. So what this does from a funding perspective is it actually will reduce your contributions going forward. And if you think about it, when somebody goes to retire, they have those various optional payment forms, and their monthly benefit is adjusted for the payment form that they elect. So let's say their single life annuity, only payable for their lifetime, is $100, but they say, I want to have spousal coverage, so I want the joint and survivor form of payment. So that $100 will then be reduced to, say, $90. And I'm just throwing an example out there. But it'll be $90, and so they receive a smaller monthly benefit for their lifetime. But then when they become deceased, their spouse then, if still living, will have a continuation of the benefit. And so the idea is that the two forms of benefit will result in the same amount of money coming out of the plan. So in present value terms. And so by reflecting that a significant portion of your retirees are taking that smaller benefit but still have a survivor benefit going on after that, what it's doing is it's lowering the initial funding liability. And so similar to how the mortality change is going to increase the contribution by $500,000, this change would decrease the liability by about $150,000. And so this was based, again, just on the data that we had. So we looked at your current retirees that were in payment as of July 1st of 2023 to make this recommendation. So I'll pause to see if there's any questions on that.
I don't think there's any questions there either.
Okay, great. So turning to slide 6, we also looked at rates of retirement. So when are your employees retiring and starting their benefit payments? We looked at retirees that were currently living and collecting benefits, and they had retired between 2018 and 2023. And what we found is those rates of retirement were still in line with the experience of the plan that the prior actuary had looked at in 2018 for their experience study. And so we have no recommended changes to that at this time. And then again, I mentioned earlier, the other assumptions, we need to wait until we have sufficient data in order to look at termination rates, in order to look at various things like that that could impact the funding of the plan, but we can't look at 1 year and call that credible and sufficient to make a recommendation at this time. And so we will monitor year to year. We kind of monitor what the assumptions are compared to what actually happens in the plan to make sure there's nothing that seems really off or concerning with the assumptions that's causing, a big loss year after year, that type of thing. But once we have sufficient data, we would do a larger experience review once again to see if there's any recommended changes to it. So overall, with the changes that we're recommending, the net cost impact will be an increase of your annual contribution of approximately $350,000. And again, that would be through 2041 based on the current funding policy. I know that you can't make a decision on these today, but I'll pause again to see if there's any overall questions you may have.
No, I don't see any questions on this either. Are we going to talk about the potential of at some point just designating a fixed dollar amount versus a percentage of payroll?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's going to be what we're jumping into next.
Okay.
So, yes. So on slide 7, yes, thanks, Aaron, for leading us right to the next. So on slide 7, we want to talk about the current funding policy, and really, again, I stated it on the slide, but want to emphasize here, this is a discussion. It's not meant to be a decision has to be made right here, right now, or even this year. We're going to talk about maybe a possible change that will come 2 years from now. But if we continue status quo with the current funding policy, the city's going to run into some significant volatility and risk when it comes to contributions that will have to be put into the pension plan. So, as I mentioned earlier, the current policy essentially, when you have a gain or loss each year, or you have assumption changes that you're recognizing each year, it will take whatever that cost is, so the change in liability because of a gain or loss that occurred or because of an assumption change that occurred, and it says, how do I pay this off from the period today until 2041? And the idea behind that policy essentially says, in 2041, the plan will be 100% funded no matter what. Okay, so the idea is when you have historical experience that differs from your assumptions, you're going to fund it over time or take credit if you have a gain. If assets return more than what they're assumed to, then you would have a gain, a credit towards your contribution. But you're working towards this goal that in 2041 you'll be fully funded. The trouble comes that as we approach 2041, the payment period that you're spreading that gain or loss over becomes shorter and shorter. And so if you have a significant loss, like a market downturn, then the city is going to have to make up that loss in 5 years, in 4 years, 3, 2, 1, immediately. And so it becomes really unsustainable from a budgetary perspective. And so that's why we want to have this conversation and and show you what some of the options could be, and really just try to start getting the conversation going and getting you to think about what you may want to do from a fiduciary perspective as you're trying to manage this plan and have it incorporated into the city's overall budget. So on slide 8, we're going to focus in on that amortization period. And the method, there's two common methods that can be used. One is a fixed period amortization policy, which is the current policy. So again, under this, no matter what happens in a given year, it says we're going to fund that gain or loss. We're going to recognize it so that in 2041, there's no outstanding gain or loss within the plan. So whatever happens from now until 2041, we're gonna pay it off by that year. Now, the layered amortization period, what that talks about is, or the method behind that is, each year when you have a gain or loss, you establish a completely new base. So in the example on the slides here, we say that a 15-year period. And under Tennessee law, it has to be 30 years or less, okay, is kind of the range that you have for it. So if we do 15 years, we say that if the assets are poor, return less than expected, we have a loss that we have to recognize. So we're going to take whatever that loss is for the given year, and we're going to spread out payment or recognition of it over 15 years. And so no matter what happens in a given year, the city has 15 years to budget for that correction, to bring the plan back to full funding. Okay, so because we establish a new base every year, the year 2041 becomes obsolete. It'll be applicable just for one of the bases, and then the next year be 2042, the next year 2043, because it'll be 15 years later, year after year. And again, we have some tables to try to illustrate this numerically as well, and so that's on page 9. Okay, so what this table is going to show is that the current plan year that we're going to be working on, the July 1, 2024, the current policy states that there's 17 years to smooth out any gains or losses in order for the last payment to be in 2041. So if we continue that policy for the next 2 years, so you see the last date of payment stays 2041 for the next 1, 2, 3 years, but then after that, we begin implementing the layered amortization, where instead of the 15 years for the length of amortization, instead of that dropping to 14 years in 2027, we're going to keep it 15 years. So now whatever gain or loss occurs in that year, during the 2027 fiscal year, we're going to recognize it over 15 years instead of 14 years. Okay, to try to smooth out the volatility of the contributions for the city and keep that long-term nature within the pension plan.
And Amy, we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago. I think you had mentioned a couple of options of 10, 15, or 20. And I believe we spoke with Bob that day, but I believe you said TCRS is on a 20-year amortization. Is that correct?
That's correct. And TCRS, they have some groups are frozen, where no new participants are coming in, similar to the city, and other groups are open.
Right.
And so by going in between, kind of what's behind our thoughts on that is eventually the city's pension plan is going to come to a place where there's no active participants, there's no additional not contributions, no additional benefits being accrued under the plan. You're simply in a full payout mode of the plan. And so if you continue to say gains and losses will be spread out over 30 years, we'll come to a point where the group isn't going to live for 30 years. And so those gains and losses are going to have to just be recognized. But when we get to that point, the group is going to get smaller and smaller. So the size of the pension plan and contributions going into it is going to get smaller and smaller and not be quite as volatile as it currently is. But that's kind of the idea of going kind of in the middle, that 15 years. The 10 years, that's based on the current active population within the pension plan. We think that they have about 10 more years on average that they'll be working for the city before they start receiving retirement benefits. So we have about 10 years, we believe, of the current active population within the plan. So that's kind of where the different numbers came from.
Okay. Well, and I know we talked about kind of delaying making this assumption change until we were going to line up with that 2041 and beyond date, versus doing it now because we've got the 2041 date already established. So it seemed logical to just say, okay, let's study this assumption change. And I like the layered approach for that smoothing for us, for budgetary purposes and everything. And just would we need to vote on this time next year for that to be effective?
No.
Okay.
This would be 2 or 3 years from now.
Okay.
There would have to be, you would have to adopt a change to your funding policy of the pension plan.
Okay.
My only comment is I thought that at the point in which, or maybe shortly after a few years, that the pension, that all the beneficiaries are no longer working, so it's full payout mode. I thought at that point in time there would be a potential or possibility of perhaps getting an annuity. They just buy that and then just we're done.
But we want it to be funded. The plan would need to be funded. I would assume. We did that with the Murfreesboro Electric pension last year.
Okay.
And it was fully funded, but we still had to time the market with the rates and everything and still had to buy annuities at that point. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, Amy. I would just assume that we would be, if we bought annuities for the plan, because I do expect that'll probably be what we do also, the better funded the plan, the better marketable we would be to the annuity market.
The plan funding would not impact the marketability of the plan because the insurer where you place the annuities, they won't care if the funds are coming from the plan assets themselves or the city. But in light of that, I mean, we can look at this in a couple years, and if that's still the goal of the city, then we can continue to allow the current policy to remain in place. And alternatively, you could switch to this layered so that you have a minimum that's not quite so volatile as we continue going, because we don't know what the interest rate market is going to be 3 years from now or 10 years from now when your active population is no longer there. And so if interest rates go back down and are low, then the annuity cost, the cost to go out and purchase those annuities is going to be much higher than planned funding. So if you take the layered approach, you have a minimum contribution, but the city could always put in more than the minimum. And so that could be another option. And in hearing that may be what you're looking to do, a consideration that you may have is to actually go out and annuitize some of the current retirees. Like if that's the goal, not to ride out the pension plan until it's completely, the last payment is paid to the last retiree or survivor, then the current market today is high interest rates to where it's not as costly today as it has been historically for the annuities. And so that might be something where if somebody's currently in payment, you can purchase a non-participating annuity and have them be off the books, out of the plan, without having to terminate the whole plan. So that could be another option.
Okay. I didn't realize we could kind of bifurcate it like that, but okay.
Yeah. That's definitely something to consider. Especially with
Yeah,
rates.
With rates where they are, yeah, I mean, okay.
Yeah.
That's the only time you benefit from that. So,
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and sure. And Aaron, I don't know if you need a full approval of the board to wait until you have a quorum, but we could send those things out to quote. I know when we did the MED plan, we worked with another company too, but we could send the current retirees out to quote to give you an idea of what the cost would currently be today.
Sure.
Sure, yeah.
We can, yeah.
More information, the better.
I agree.
Okay, we will do that.
Thank you. Good question, Greg.
That's what you pay me for.
That's right. We get our money's worth.
Okay, so on the next two pages, again, this is really just emphasizing the current policy versus the proposed layered policy. So I don't know if some of you are more numbers oriented, but that's why we wanted to do these illustrations. So on slide 10, we were looking at in the year 2027, let's say there is a hypothetical loss of 30 million, which sounds really extreme, but when you think about the plan where it currently is, if the market, the asset market, if there was a loss of 10%, so a negative 10% return, you have that negative 10%, but then you also have, we assume that you are going to earn between 6 and 7%. I don't recall the exact number off the top of my head. And so the actuarial loss is really a negative 16%. And so that's why, we're showing that this could be a possibility at some time just with the volatility in the market from different years. So when we're looking at that top line shows the current amortization payment. So this is a component within your actuarially determined contribution or minimum contribution rate that you're putting into the plan. And so if you have all the years leading up to 2027, there's no gains and losses. Everything happens as we assume it will. Then in 2027, because of that $30 million loss under the current policy, you would see a contribution increase, an annual contribution increase of about $3.2 million. And then under the layered policy, you would see an increase of about $3.07 million, okay, a difference of $128,000 in your annual contribution. But moving on to slide 11, what if that loss happened in the year 2039, which is only 2 years before that 2041 end date for funding? So if that were to occur, under the current policy, you would see an increase in your annual contribution of $15.5 million. And then under the proposed layer contribution, again, sticking with that $3.07 million. So this is kind of an extreme illustration of if you do nothing and stick with the status quo, that's the kind of volatility that you could see in the contribution from year to year.
Eyes wide
Okay,
open.
so...
Great, thanks, Amy.
So on slide 12, we're going to kind of wrap up with this on funding policies. There's a couple other considerations. Again, when we say a closed plan, we're talking about pension plan where no new active employees are earning benefits under the plan. There's no new active participants going into the plan. You have a grandfathered closed group. So one of the items is the timing of the contributions. When we determine the actuarially determined contribution rate, the last one we determined was July 1, 2023. That's actually what you just implemented this month, at the beginning of this month when payroll occurred. And so there's a 1-year lag a 1-year lag between when we determine that rate and when contributions are actually being put in. And with the grandfathered group, because it's percentage of pay, the total payroll is shrinking each year. So we calculate a percentage of pay, but then there's a whole year lag to where now we have less participants a year from that determination, and so less than the dollar amount that would have gone in if it wasn't a percentage of pay. So I hope that I was able to articulate that well. So the next step would be contribution. So currently it's a percentage of your covered payroll. Once the actives are gone, like we said, based on assumptions, we think within the next 10 years, around that time frame, most of the actives will be in an inactive status, so currently collecting benefits or waiting to be eligible to collect. And so it's going to be necessary to set your budget based on a dollar amount rather than a percentage of payroll. And the TCRS, we just note here that the TCRS, they currently do a percentage of covered payroll, just like the city, but in some of those plans where it's closed groups, they are going to have to address the same issue into the future. So in our report, everything is based on a dollar figure, liabilities, assets, shortfall, those types of things, and then we convert that dollar amount into a percentage of payroll. And so at some point we'll have to switch from the percentage of payroll to the dollar amount. And this is something, when I reviewed the latest actuarial report, you saw that ADC rate will continue to go up. But a big part of that is because your payroll, your overall payroll is shrinking. So the dollar amount may not be as significant of changes from year to year, but the percentage of a shrinking payroll will continue to increase. So I will pause to see if there's any questions on that or overall.
I know we've talked about that for a few years back when Michael Guyton was doing our actuarial studies, and the best example I can give is I will be one of the last active members, assuming I make it to retirement age, and when we are contributing 10,000% of my payroll, it's not for me, it's for the plan.
Right.
It's so I think that's definitely something that we're button up against quickly that could might make it simpler for budgeting as well, and to make sure that we are funding as much as they're expecting us to fund.
This is very good, Amy. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Amy.
Thank you. So then, Aaron, would you like me to move on to our engagement?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay. So also included in your meeting booklet, we have put together and proposed a 4-year fee agreement, service agreement for the actuarial services for the pension plan. When we were hired, originally we had a 1-year agreement, and the annual fee was $40,000. And so now we've extended that agreement to be a 4-year agreement with the annual fees increasing $1,000 each year. So for the current fiscal year that we're in, the annual fee would be $41,000, and then $42,000, $43,000, and $44,000 through the 2028 fiscal year. And those increases are about 2.5%.
The pension committee does not oversee the city's OPEB requirements, which is our other post-employment benefits for health care for retirees. But this contract kind of aligns with that same timing because it's an every 2-year contract. And so when Amy and I actually talked about this last week, we looked at going ahead and doing this so that we had the next 2 OPEB reports as well as these reports all lined up, kind of simultaneous. for audit, it's very helpful for audit purposes to have that already lined
Yeah,
up.
okay.
Well, I don't see any questions on that either, Amy. And then we have the special invoice that we'll submit to the committee next month as well. This was for the funding method recommendations that she just did. That was outside of the scope of our normal actuarial contract.
Okay.
And then I've also reached out to her for, to propose, I think the proposal on that. Amy, was it 5,000 for the proposal for the public safety?
Yes.
Okay, so I had asked her to also, and that will probably come to the next meeting, but the actuarial assumptions for payroll increases each year are 4%. We have been giving greater than 4% raises to our public safety employees the last couple of years, and so we're seeing kind of a larger fluctuation in that annual contribution rate because of that. So we discussed maybe potentially increasing that either permanently or on a short-term basis for like maybe the next 5 years, just to reflect what's actually
Catch up.
occurring
Okay.
on our payroll trends. Okay, Amy, well, thank you. I think we'll switch over now to Natalka's presentation with Fiducient on our market review.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. You might want to speak into the microphone, it'd be easier if Amy's
Hi,
still on
Amy.
the line. Does she
Is
hang
Amy
up
still
Yes,
on?
I'm here.
Okay.
I am.
Oh, hey, Amy, it's Chris Rollins from Fiducient. How are you?
Good, how are you, Chris?
I'm doing great. Can I just come back to the retiree carve-out? So we've done a lot of work for corporate pension plans along the lines of plan terminations and retiree carve-outs, and the impetus for that is, obviously minimize PBGC premiums and reduce the liabilities footprint on the balance sheet, but it's much easier given the way that the liabilities are discounted against a corporate bond yield curve. In fact, in 2023, we saw some of those carve-outs where the liabilities were being settled at a discount. But for this plan, you're discounting the liabilities at a 7% return versus current annuity rates are 5.25 or 5.50. So wouldn't it be very, very expensive to do a carve-out? And I'm just trying to understand the economic benefit from the public lens to do that.
Right. Yeah, Chris, thank you for your question. That is true. We also work in the private and see that as well. So the benefit here and why I suggest the committee look at it is because if their goal is in 10 years to do this anyway, then they could look at the current cost today while the interest rates have been high, because we know eventually the feds are going to lower the interest rate. And I don't know if you'll be talking about this in your presentation, but eventually the feds are going to start lowering that interest rate. And so once they start doing that, then the difference between the now 5.5 to 7% is going to increase, and so costs are going to increase into the future. And so with taking a look at what is the current cost today, the city will be able to say, can we take a portion of this group out today, knowing that the interest rates are higher than they've been, over the past 15 years, and then can we afford to increase contributions in order to take them out today and possibly save when we go to terminate the entire plan 10, 15, 20 years from now. So that would be kind of my thoughts behind it, is we can go out to quote and the city could decide not to do anything with it. We want to make sure they understand what the costs are, certainly, before making a decision on it. But the interest rates today are a lot closer to their 7% assumption than what they have been. And that was something that the city was looking at with the MED plan when they went to terminate that. It was really a matter of timing, and that's why, there was that 3 years or 2.5 years from when the agreement with the MED took place before they terminated the plan.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, good question, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. So, yeah, there'll be a meaningful premium.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, great. Well, at least you got the numbers in front of you. So maybe we should.
Yep, I was going to say Chris will come to the microphone. So Chris will lead off the presentation today with an overview of capital markets, primarily for the second quarter, but also a bit of a year-to-date review, and also lead into some comments on the new asset allocation for the plan, which will then set me up for performance and rebalancing discussions to follow. So, Chris?
Yeah, great. Well, good morning, everybody, and those on the line as well. We have the monthly performance update. It happens to be the June 30th performance update, which is a really key number from the figure that goes into the book, the fiscal year number. So we're pleased to report that we are well exceeded the discount rate, as Natalka will go through. That marks the second consecutive year where you've exceeded the discount rate, and Amy will talk about, or has talked about, the benefit of actuarial gains in terms of your funded status and how that return gets kind of amortized or smoothed along those lines. So what I'm going to do is maybe begin on page 6. And before I do, tomorrow we have our firm's mid-year capital markets update. I'm not too sure if you received the email from the firm, but it is tomorrow, July 18th at 12:30 Eastern Time. And so purpose of this webcast is sort of the key themes driving the market in 2024 in the second half, and latest insights on portfolio positions and asset allocations and relevant topics such as sort of the political environment and impact on capital markets going forward. So we invite you to join or participate in that webcast, and Natalka and I can follow up with that link or that invite. But within our report, I think I'll begin on page 6, which provides just kind of capital market returns for the period as you see before you, and I think I'll focus on kind of year-to-date and the one-year time period, because the one-year time period is the fiscal year. I'll begin with kind of the fixed income markets, where yields have been kind of, across the board. And if you think really kind of a roller coaster, it really has that shape. We began the year with the 10-year yield at around 388, and as we began the year, the calendar year, there was a lot of thinking that the Fed would embark aggressively on a number of interest rate cuts. But as we progressed into January and February and March, there were clear signs that inflation numbers were stubbornly high, and that really tied the Fed's hand. So interest rates actually moved higher. So we moved from 388, we moved up to about 420, 440, and then we got into April, we had moved as high as 470, and now as we speak today, given that we've gotten a little bit more favorable print on inflation, that yield is back down to 417, and so you kind of have this kind of trough and then peak and then back down to 417, and Natalka will talk about really kind of the benefit of the allocation changes that we made in terms of getting into some of these fixed income allocations, or increasing our fixed income allocation when yields were north of 450, 460, and 470, and as they trend down to 417 as we speak today, that increases the value of those bond holdings. So if you look at the one-year number for the U.S. aggregate bond index, the print is a little bit small here. The ag was up about 2.6% return for the one-year basis ending 6/30. So that's your fiscal year. But the ag is really interest rate sensitive, government centric, so it is very sensitive to interest rate changes, but, within our fixed income allocation, we're very well diversified across corporate bonds, investment grade bonds, as an example. We have a high yield position, and then those have been areas of the bond market that have done very well. The reason they've done so well is that, corporate fundamentals, corporate earnings continue to be very healthy, and so investors have gravitated towards that area of the bond market and produced very attractive results. Corporate high yield bonds, as an example, was up 10.4% on a one-year basis. So these are areas of the market that are more sensitive to the dynamics with the economy and corporate America and balance sheets as opposed to directionally changes in interest rates. So it's important within, you look at fixed income as our portfolio stands today, is to be well diversified within the bond market, but we also want to be sensitive of, we don't want to take a lot of credit risk, right? We don't want our fixed income portfolio looking or behaving like our equity portfolio. We want it to be high credit quality, and we want it to provide diversification and a level of income that is appropriate with this governing body's risk tolerance. So as you move outside fixed income, so the dynamics there has been, the bond market really looking at Fed comments and directionally, where the Fed has been, and through the first half of the year, the Fed had not moved to lower interest rates. As I speak today, here in July, there is clear signals that the Fed is likely to cut rates in September, which will be beneficial to bond holdings on a go-forward basis. So global equities, I think the theme here is, as we talked about in 2023 in the first quarter, is this kind of this AI, artificial intelligence, large cap continue to dominate, and U.S. markets continue to dominate over developed markets and emerging markets outside the U.S. So the S&P 500, as you can see, either for the month or year to date, was notably higher. We were up 3.6% in June. Year to date, 15.3%, and then 24.6% on a one-year basis. And if you look just below that, you'll see the Dow, which is more cyclically sensitive, which has weights to, or greater weights to industrials and energies and financials, and less so technology. You'll see that the returns are more tempered. So these magnificent seven, as they're known today, these big mega cap technology stocks like Meta and others, NVIDIA, are really driving a significant amount of the return in the capital markets. So the S&P up 24%, NASDAQ up 30%, as you can see. And as you descend in capitalization, so as we get outside sort of the big behemoth, large cap names, you start getting into some of the smaller capitalization stocks. And these are companies that are more heavily reliant on traditional borrowing methods. So a higher interest rate environment, a higher for longer interest rate environment that played out in the first half of this year, really kind of does not bode too well for small cap stocks. Although, again, a 9%, 10%, 11% return is nothing to kind of frown upon. Solid results, but meaningfully trailing the performance of large caps. As we speak today, we are seeing a meaningful rotation out of some of these mega cap names into small cap. In fact, I think over the last week, we were talking earlier this morning that the small caps were up 10% for the week, and that's driven by expectations that rate cuts will be forthcoming, and that certainly benefits small company stocks, which as I mentioned earlier, more heavily reliant on traditional borrowing methods. So, really good numbers here in the U.S., really driven by technology and anything kind of associated with artificial intelligence. So, semiconductors, as an example, benefiting as well. So when you go outside the U.S. borders into the international markets, a little bit of volatility in June, right? If you turn on the news, there were a lot of high-profile elections, kind of that had an impact on developed markets, certainly in Europe, but emerging markets were up 4%. So we did get some good numbers in India and China as well. And then on the one-year basis, you can see that international markets were up 11.5%. Think about international, EFA, Europe, Eurozone. Japan as developed markets, and when we talk about emerging markets, think along the lines of Latin America and China and India. Had solid returns, but again, trailing those of the U.S. Because, kind of in the developed markets, international, more traditional lines of sectors like industrials and financials have a greater weight in those indices, and technology less so. When you get into emerging markets, that's where you see kind of semiconductors, think about Taiwan and South Korea, have a more prominent role in that area of the marketplace. So to wrap up kind of capital market performance on a one-year basis, really solid results for fixed income, kind of designed to provide that ballast within a portfolio setting. You can see the ag up 2.6%, but then other areas of the bond market, like high yield investment grade, perform much better. And then here in global equity markets, U.S. markets did much better than international markets. We certainly have a allocation setting which favors the U.S. markets, just given the global opportunity set. So that certainly helped from a total return perspective as well. And then lastly, REITs, I'll point out, was up 7.8%. So despite sort of a challenging interest rate environment, REITs performed very well for the fiscal year. Just try to move the slide here. I apologize. So I'm going to just jump to asset allocation. I'll have Nataka come back to performance if you'd like. On page 9, so as you can see here is the asset allocation for the portfolio from June to May. We have currently, as we speak, about 34% allocated to fixed income, really with kind of a core-centric type of strategy, again, aligned with that aggregate index. So with Pinnacle and Baird, TCW, Western, and Lord Abbett have a little bit more flexible mandates as well, and we are gradually reducing our allocation to TCW, which we have as an organization placed on terminate for all of our clients that have exposure to the firm on a go-forward basis. And then domestic equity is roughly 31%, with Pinnacle large cap as the heaviest weight within the portfolio. So as you build sort of that profile within fixed income, within equity, right, you go kind of less riskier, has a bigger allocation, then you get down to mid and the small caps have a smaller allocation just given the riskier profile. And then our international allocation really reflects the opportunity set outside of the U.S. borders, so 17% there. And then we have a 16% allocation to real assets, which is the managed by a number of strategies along the lines of REITs and then real assets as well. And then lastly on page 10, just to give an update to the committee as we move towards the target, right? You may recall that each year what we do as a firm is we produce our capital market assumptions and then we re-underwrite the investment portfolio. And we do that to ensure it aligns with your discount rate, it aligns with your goals and objectives. And as we talked about earlier this year, the restoration of higher yields has a silver lining, particularly to public pension plans or endowments or foundations or any asset allocation setting that relies on fixed income. Over the last decade or so, fixed income has just not been able to generate a meaningful amount of yield, so plans had to be more aggressive. They had to take on more equity risk. They had to take on alternative risk, such as privates, as an example, to better align with achieving that discount rate. But with the restoration of higher yields, it is an opportunity to take advantage of higher yields and increase the allocation to fixed income and still have a high probability of hitting our discount rate of 7%. So it is really a transformative event that, all these series of interest rate hikes has restored bond yields to levels where now that can provide that ballast within a portfolio setting. So our objective is through a dollar cost strategy, right? right? We didn't want to just jump into fixed income. We've taken a judicious approach, but a timely approach is to start gradually getting more closer towards that 44% allocation. Some of the changes that we made, again, in May were rather timely when rates were at 450 or 470, and you think where rates are today at 417. Those are some really good trades that were implemented. So as we get closer to that 44%, that's the ultimate goal. We'll continue to walk through this dollar cost averaging strategy, which Nataka will highlight in a moment. But I think that's what I have from an observation perspective. If I could maybe field any questions, but...
Any questions on broad markets or the new strategic asset allocation?
No? All right.
I don't think so.
All right.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
And if, let's see, and if I can,
What do you want?
I need the 1Q one. Yeah, no, just, so I am moving, we're going to go back in time to a kinder, gentler period, the first quarter of 2024, and just quickly review performance and go through the rebalancing program that we began in March after the committee approved the new strategic asset allocation. So if you're either in the hard copies, or I will try to, on the screen here, go to certain pages in the presentation. I'm going to start with page 15 of the first quarter report. Let me just see if I can... And this page, we call it the performance dashboard. It's one of my favorite pages. In the performance report, you get a lot of information on market values of the plan, performance, and asset allocation, all in one snapshot. So the plan got off to a very solid start in the first quarter of 2024. Assets rose from at the beginning of the year, $172.7 million to $180.1 million on March 31st. This translated into a total return of 4.6% for the plan versus 3.6% for the target policy, so 1% ahead of target. There were $542,323 of net withdrawals in the plan in the first quarter and $7.9 million of investment gains. As Chris mentioned, we also track your performance on a fiscal year basis because that's when your books and a lot of other things are based on and closed and based on. So at the end of the first quarter, you were 9 months into the fiscal year, and your performance was strong, 10.8% versus the target policy of 10%. As Chris mentioned, for the full fiscal year through June 30th, you ended with a 10.7% fiscal year to date return versus 10.4% for the target policy. As a reminder, your actuarial interest rate assumption is 7%. So our goal is to try to meet or exceed that as often and as consistently as possible. And as Chris mentioned, the last 2 years, you've been in the black and ahead of target. Another perhaps interesting comparison for you is yesterday in the financial press, CalPERS, so California Public Employee Retirement System, probably the largest public retirement system in the country, announced that its fiscal year-to-date return through June 30th was 9.3%. Wow. And they were pretty happy about that. So you get bragging rights this year. You beat CalPERS. So kudos to your asset allocation and kudos to your investment team that pulled that off. If we go to page 23 of this report, we're going to take a quick look at your investment teams first, and then in subsequent pages, we'll have each individual manager performance. But in the first quarter of 2024, all the teams, fixed income, domestic equity, your international global equity team, and your real assets team, all topped their respective targets by somewhere between 0.2 and 1.1%. In short, the portfolio was firing on all cylinders. That doesn't always happen, but I'm happy to be here during the quarter to report on that and say that happened in the first quarter, so a strong start. The fixed income team, as Chris mentioned, you have a very diversified fixed income portfolio. You have 5 managers. In the first quarter, all 5 topped their respective targets. The rebalancing program and the new towards the new strategic target is going to be raising your fixed income exposure from a 34% target to 44%. And to me, it's always scary to rebalance because it's really hard to get the timing right, and that's why we're doing it in stages and dollar cost averaging in. So that program is underway, and also during that program, in addition to increasing the target to fixed income, we're also restructuring the composition of your fixed income portfolio to upgrade the quality. So we're going towards the more high-quality core bonds. We're reducing the mortgage-backed bond exposure and reducing some high yield in favor of multi-sector bonds. All this, we're hoping, de-risks the fixed income portfolio and gives you a smoother ride going forward to more consistently meet your actuarial interest rate assumption and defend the gains you're making in your funded status of the plan. Your domestic equity team. You have 6 managers in domestic equity across large, mid, small cap, growth, and value. In the first quarter, only 1 manager, Janus Henderson Enterprise, your mid-cap growth manager, fell short of target. They've been having a little bit of a tough year. But their long-term record is very strong. There's been no changes in the management team. We're not overly concerned at this point in time, but we're going to be watching for improvement. And indeed, we did see improvement in the second quarter. But we'll keep an eye on them. Your global equity managers, you have 2 in place, both topped their performance target. Particularly strong is Janus Henderson Global Research. They've been strong in the short term and the long term. They have a growth focus, and they also have very minimal emerging markets exposure, which has helped them over the last couple of years. It's been a little bit of a headwind this year because, as Chris pointed out, emerging markets have actually exceeded developed market performance on a year-to-date basis. Dodge & Cox and Invesco Developing Markets, those are your 2 international funds. Dodge & Cox, a core international fund. Invesco Developing Markets is your emerging markets manager. Both of them lagged in the first quarter. We're watching the Invesco Developing Markets Fund very closely. They've had performance difficulties for the past, I'm going to say, 18 to 24 months. The firm, as well as Chris and I, are watching them very closely. And if we don't see an improvement in the performance trend in the next couple of quarters, we'll probably be presenting the committee with a screen or a search report with other emerging markets managers. So we'd like you to maintain emerging markets exposure. In your new allocation, it's going to be a 5% exposure. We want to make sure you're with a very competitive manager in that space. Real assets. You have 3 REIT managers, 1 global, 2 domestic REIT managers, and your natural resources manager, which is actually an index ETF fund. 2 of the 3 REIT managers topped their respective targets, and only Principal's U.S. REIT fund lagged in the first quarter. Commodities and natural resources has been a strong place to be. because you're in an index ETF, you virtually matched your target there. Chris had mentioned with the new asset allocation, we're reducing exposure to real assets. Originally, you had a target of 23%. We're taking that down to a 14% target, with the largest decrease being in the REIT space, going from 17 down to a new target of 10%. At the end of the first quarter, you were at about 16% in REIT exposure. So that we actually began that process even before the formal asset allocation change, so we're well on our way there. Before I touch on some of the rebalancing, any questions that anybody has on managers or performance in the first quarter? Okay, so a good team in place. I guess, the numbers speak volumes.
Yep.
So for rebalancing recommendations, just as a review for you, you've seen it on a few of the tables, but if you go to page 21, so we'll back up a little bit here. Okay. In March, we recommended the first stage of rebalancing towards the new strategic target asset mix, and it focused on adding to your core bond positions, Pinnacle and Baird, and reducing high yield and mortgage-backed bonds, trimming overweight positions in large cap equity and small cap domestic equity, adding to global and international equity, and trimming global REITs and natural resources. We also periodically add to your operational cash position. You have a 1% target. We've been running that a little bit higher, closer to 2% for the last 2 years. With market volatility, we think it's prudent for you to have 6 to 9 months of your pension benefits in an operational cash account so that you're not in a position of having to liquidate at a bad month or a bad quarter in the marketplace. And fortunately, for the past year, having a little bit of extra money in cash, earning 5.25%, has not necessarily been a detriment to the portfolio. So it's been a lot easier to do that. So that was the rebalancing that was recommended in March and was executed in April. The month of April was a negative month in the market, and there were no rebalancing recommendations that we made during the month of April. In May was a rebound month. I can sort of pull up the May report. And we did make rebalancing recommendations, which are on page 6 of the May report. And again, it followed the same theme as the rebalancing that was done at the end of March, beginning of April, where we continued to reduce domestic equity and REIT exposure on strength, and added to underweight global and international equities, and adding to and restructuring the fixed income exposure, reducing the mortgage-backed bonds, increasing the high-quality core intermediate bonds, and also the multi-sector bond fund, Western Asset. Those trades were executed at the beginning of June. So there have been 2 tranches of dollar cost averaging into your new strategic asset allocation. The last column on this page shows you the resulting allocations after the May rebalancing, and you can see that, for instance, in real assets, after the rebalancing, you were down to 16.1% in real assets versus a 14% target. So we still have a little ways to go, but we've made progress. We took it down from 17.4% at the end of April to 16.1%. Now I'm going to go back to Chris's June report. Sorry to have you jumping around so much, but we do have rebalancing recommendations for the month of June as well for the committee's consideration. And again, this would be the third tranche following the same theme of moving towards the strategic allocation. And so again, we would be adding to and restructuring fixed income exposure and reducing small cap equity and your REIT exposure. This not natural resources at this time because we're very close there. So if these recommendations are approved, and once again, if we look at that last column, resulting allocation, you'll be down to a 15.2% allocation in real assets. So once again, getting ever closer to the 14% target. And if we go up to fixed income, we'll be at 36% versus the 44% target, so increasing that exposure. So, you know, it's, as I mentioned, it's always, you know, dicey to pull the trigger on these dollar cost averaging moves. And we have been fortunate that, you know, by doing sort of just a very steady process and sort of allowing the market to guide us and provide us with some opportunities. I mean, it's a good time to trim small cap equities after this week, after a 10.5% gain month to date in July for small cap. It's a good time to trim, take some of those profits, and you know, keep steadily moving towards your strategic allocation. So, you know, hopefully good news is quick to deliver. I think there's a lot of good news here for the plan, and happy to entertain any questions. I'll also mention that in the quarterly reports, we provide fund fact sheets and manager profiles on all of your mutual fund and ETF investments. So if you ever want more detail on each individual manager, Chris and I are always available to provide that, but it's also provided to you in a lot of those fact sheets if you want to do a deeper dive.
Okay. Well, I know when I get the monthly report, I go straight to that dashboard too, Natalka, so it's my favorite also.
It is.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm sorry that we're not able to vote on any action items today, but we can, like I said before, Frida can send out the rebalancing recommendations to the committee and hopefully get those processed next week or so. So,
Great.
Kathy, did you have any other business to come before the committee? We're down to 2.
Okay, well, a
thank
lot
you.
of numbers today, but hopefully we brought some life to the situation and kept it interesting.
That's right, absolutely. Okay, well, thank y'all very much.
Thank you.